Hello and welcome to another episode of Faith and Spirituality in a Time of Crisis. My name is Chris Fuller. I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College in Maine. This is a series of conversations with local faith leaders and philosophers and theologians around the country about how we can adapt spiritually to this challenging time. My guest today is Dr. Eric Hall. Dr. Hall is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Theology at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. He is also author of the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God, Everything You Want to Know About the Almighty. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you, too. So, Eric, I asked you to be on with me today to talk about philosophy. We tend to think of philosophy as highfalutin ideas that people do when they have the time to think them, rather than a way of being, a way of thinking about the world.
Right.
And I know this is something you do with your students, right? You and the work you do with your students is to make theology, to make philosophy grounded in their lived experience, something meaningful for them. So that's why I wanted to have you on today, was talk about, how can philosophy aid us in this time of self-distancing, of social isolation? How would you help walk us through the value of philosophy at a time like this?
Yeah, great. That's an awesome question. It's a tough question too. Complex question, believe it or not. Let me start a little bit further back, because I think if we want philosophy to aid us, we got to do the right philosophical thing here, and we got to come up with a definition of philosophy.
Good, that's helpful. Yeah.
And, I think you're right. Most people think of philosophy as walking around in a toga. If you're lucky, you can grow a sweet Nietzschean mustache. Just look up Nietzsche if you don't know what I'm talking about, and you will be utterly impressed by the magnitude of the man's mustache. Whatever it is, we tend to associate it with a highfalutin life, right? Whereas in reality, you look at someone like Socrates, and he was conscientiously poor for the sake of the pursuit of philosophy. And you have any number of other people who find themselves in the same position, thinking that it is valuable enough on its own to pursue, that they're willing to give up any other number of worldly possessions for its sake. The church, early church, by the way, buys into this as well. So I just want to put that out there first, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful.
So then the question is, what is philosophy? Let me start with a metaphor. We both work at colleges, and I'd say 90% of what constitutes a college is that our students have crushes on each other. That's just like 10% learning, 90% crushes, if I was to break down what happens at college. Why is that important? Well, here's where I'm pointing to. We've all been in that situation of our college students whereby we have a crush on someone who doesn't really like us back, right? And we've got a couple choices as to how we'll interpret the data that might bring us into that. So, for instance, if I ask a person out because I have a crush on them and they're not interested, or if I send them a text and they don't respond, and then I send them another text and they don't respond, and then I send them another text and they don't respond, or I notice them walking across campus and actively trying to avoid me, I got a couple things I can do with this situation. Number one, I can read the data and move beyond what I want to be the case and affirm the difficulty of the situation that the person doesn't like me back, right? Let's call that the philosophical option. Number two, I can try to conform the data that is being given off by this person, the cues, the emotionality given off by this person, I can ignore it. And I can try to conform it to what I want to be the case. In that case, I say that the person is playing hard to get. You see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
This is an example pointing to what philosophy is at its core. And all philosophy is at its core is a love of the true over and above the love of oneself. So that you love what actually is the case and are willing to comport and orient and draw your identity into how the world actually works, versus simply trying to make the world into an image of yourself and force it to conform to the small confines of your mind, your finite mind. Yeah, go ahead.
I say that's both interesting and useful, I think, given that we're at a time when there's a lot of information coming at us,
Yep.
right, over which we have no control,
right?
And so how do we, it's not just how do we make sense of the information, it's how do we place ourselves in relationship to that information, right?
Yeah.
That's what I hear you saying. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of how we have to look at our current pandemic situation, right? If we want to look at it philosophically, we have to get beyond what we hope and want to be the case. Man, I really hope for a vaccine tomorrow. Man, I really hope that we come up with a cure tomorrow. And we have to look at the actuality of the situation, potential of up to 100 to 200,000 deaths in the U.S., which is horrific, right? And we could name any number of these current scenarios. We also have to be really, really honest about our current situation and why this is such a struggle for us. And this is actually where I'll eventually want to go, and where I think maybe philosophy is helpful, because there ain't nothing new going on here. We're surprised by this contemporary situation, but it's not new. This constitutes in many ways sort of the history of the human race, which doesn't make this easy, by the way. This is a part of who we are, to face pandemic and pestilence.
So are there any examples then for you from philosophy in terms of facing these kinds of difficult real situations, philosophers who influenced you, that help you think through then these current circumstances?
Gosh, I mean, all sorts. We'll stick with the most basics, though, in terms of, Socrates really has a lot of thoughts about death and our own finitude. And really, when you jump into, even more so than philosophy, when you jump into, I'm reading just a ton on the incarnation of the word right now by St. Athanasius. People like him, I think they do really well at sort of forcing us, not forcing it, it's never a forced thing, right? But beckoning us to come to grips with our finitude, with the possibility of the loss of life, including our own or loved ones. And also accepting the fact that none of that is particularly easy to come to grips with, that we don't need to be ashamed that we're afraid of it, but that nonetheless we have to be able to sort of see into it. Socrates is really helpful. I would encourage anyone, both for spiritual and intellectual reasons, and the two really aren't that separate for me, but for spiritual and intellectual reasons, to read Plato's Apology. This is the story of Socrates and his trial. So Socrates, here's the brief story of Socrates. He likes to pursue the true, and he goes into the marketplaces and he pursues the true with a bunch of people like 2,600 years ago. What he would do is he would go into the marketplace and he would talk to the politicians, the artists, and the artisans, and he would ask them questions about things that they claimed to know. And what he would find is that they didn't know nearly as much as they claimed to know, and when they realized that, they would get angry at him. And so they put him on trial eventually, because it seemed that he was shaming those who were supposedly in charge, and eventually he gets put to death. Spoiler alert. 2,600 years of I feel okay with that spoiler. So I think it's a really helpful one, because he has a lot of reflections on death in there. Some of them are helpful, some of them are not. That in another dialogue called The Crito, and you could actually get both of these in the $5 book from Hackett called The 5 Dialogues of Plato. So here's why I think it's helpful. In there, one of the things that Socrates reflects on is the nature of human wisdom. And what he recognizes is that the natural ends of reason are to recognize that human wisdom has limits, that it does not know everything about everything. That's divine wisdom. But it can come to a place where it knows that it does not know. And when it comes to that place, the implication is that it becomes open to the pursuit of the true beyond the confines of what you thought and what you were forcing the world to be. He applies that in many ways to the notion of death. And he does it both by example and he does it conceptually. Conceptually, he says this: when I was a soldier, and Socrates was sort of a renowned soldier, when I was a soldier, I would stand my ground because that's what my commanders told me to do, and there was great shame if I was to fall back when we were not to fall back. So I would stand my ground, and if he perceives his pursuit of the true as a divine calling, he says, so too the gods tell me to pursue the true at all costs. Now you want to scare me out of the pursuit of the truth. He's talking to the politicians here and his accuser Miletus and Anytus. Now you two want to scare me out of pursuing the true by telling me that you'll kill me if I stop pursuing the true. But what if I apply the very fact that I know nothing about death to this situation? Should I fear that which I do not know? Should I pursue the things that I know to be good and fear what I know to be bad? And I know it's bad not to pursue the true when I could pursue the true. And so he stands his ground. And he does throughout the whole of the apology, he stands his ground. And he gets ultimately he gets convicted, and one of the reasons he gets convicted, and he sort of expresses this, and I think he's right about it, he gets convicted because he's unwilling to suck up to the jury. So there's an oratorical way of existing, and there's a philosophical way of existing. The oratorical way is to link it back to that crush scenario, to simply try to get by to the next survivable moment, saying whatever you need to in order to do so. That's how most people exist. So we'll believe whatever we need to believe, we'll hope for whatever we need to hope for, and we'll say whatever we need to say, not because it's real, true, good, or beautiful, but because it just helps us to get on to the next moment so we can eat another donut. And he's saying, don't do that. I'm not willing to live that life. I'd rather die knowing that that life is a shameful life to live. What I'll do instead is I will not bring my wife and children in to grovel in front of the jury. I will speak with truth, at random, with truth, off the top of my head, and defend myself with truth. And he's very frank with the jury, and the jury ultimately doesn't like that he doesn't grovel before them, and so they basically commit him eventually to death. Crito is interesting too, and this is a statement that I have long reflected on. Let me see if I've got the Crito even right. Oh, I do. Look at this. I got to read this statement because it's one that I think about way too much. In the Crito, one of Socrates' friends, Crito, comes and tries to persuade him to allow he and his friends to break him out of jail before he's killed. And Socrates basically gives the argument as to why that's not the case and why he's fine with his own dying. And his basic argument is this, that you should never do harm to another even if they do harm to you, and he thinks he would be doing harm to the Athenian people if he were to be released. And you can read it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. But he has this toward the end of the dialogue. He says to Crito, be persuaded by us who have brought you up. Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness, in order that when you arrive in Hades, you may have all this as your defense before the rulers there. What a difficult statement. It actually reminds me of Beatitudes in certain ways. It's a really hard one for me because I can't think of other than the fact that I try to value the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and strength. I cannot think of what I value more than my wife and my children. right? And Socrates is making this difficult statement: do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness. And so one of the questions that at least emerges for me in the midst of this pandemic is how do I continue to ensure that I retain something of a modicum of a good character and through these possibilities of my demise and the demise of my family and everyone that I know and love, right? So
I think what I'm hearing you say, if I've been hearing correctly too, is then that process of trying to develop character, right? A true character requires us to be unafraid to see what's before us.
I think that's exactly right, because you can only develop, yeah, thank you, that's awesome. You can only develop true character when you're willing to face the nature and constitution of the world as it is. Now, the human species, so far as I can tell, has always existed on the precipice of extinction. There's just no denying it, just as every species does, but the human species as well. And we are coming to grips with this in the modern world as we sort of technocratically seclude ourselves off from the frankly horrific hand of nature. We romanticize nature, right? We think, oh, it's so beautiful, and it is. But it also carries with it coronavirus. So we're coming to grips with the finitude of the species, of ourselves, and really the only way that we can assess and coordinate what we value and what we should value and develop a character that allows us to live those values out is by facing that reality in its fullness and beginning the pursuit of the true, good, and beautiful life.
Good. So I think what I'm hearing for our viewers then is this is an opportunity. This time of shelter in place, right? This time of social distancing is an opportunity as well. An opportunity in so much as we look at what's before us, we're honest and unafraid about what's before us. Also becomes an opportunity then to reflect on what we value, what really matters.
Yeah, right.
Right? And how that is a part of who we are and the character of ourselves. Right.
Yep. The only way we ever find out what's actually good, so we reduce the things that are good to our feelings today. And we say that what I feel is what is good. So don't make me feel bad. Well, maybe you should feel bad. And maybe you should feel bad in light of the pandemic that we see, right? Maybe we shouldn't feel good about this situation. And instead we can truthfully assess what it says about ourselves and then truthfully try to figure out who we should be in the process and truthfully try to figure out who we should help our children become and truthfully how we can interact with our spouses and our loved ones, right? I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
So you mentioned the importance of Socrates' death in terms of philosophy that Plato writes about. Of course, in the Christian tradition, there's an important death that stands at the center of that tradition, right? Our own tradition. And you teach a class on this. You teach a class on the atonement, right?
Right.
And corresponding to that death, of course, is the entry of God into the world, right? In the incarnation. You mentioned reading Athanasius. So in terms of moving the philosophical discussion into the Christian realm, right? How might we be thinking reflectively then about what Jesus' death means? What have you learned in teaching this class that might be helpful or useful for us?
First of all, the question is, where does salvation begin? And I think one of the things that we oftentimes forget in the modern world is salvation is already beginning in and through the incarnation. And it begins like this, that whatever God takes up into God's self is saved. So St. Athanasius has like this, he has just this beautiful definition, if I can find it really quickly here. It says, by nature, of course, man is mortal since he was made from nothing. So we were breathed into the dust by the divine, or it was from the nothingness that we came, right? But he also bears likeness of him who is, namely Christ, who is the Word of God. And if he preserves that likeness through constant contemplation, then his nature is deprived of its power and he remains incorrupt. So he's sort of drawing out this vision of of what Adam and Eve were intended for. And they were intended for eternal life with one another and God, right? And if they would keep their mind on the infinite Lord and giver of life, if they would remember and see the world through his created order, then indeed they will remain incorrupt. But if they give themselves over to that self-interpretation we were talking about, the one where we claim that someone's just playing hard to get, then indeed they will give themselves over to the finitude, the nothingness from which they're drawn. They'll give themselves back over to death. Hence, St. Paul says the consequences of sin are death, right? So the first thing to note is that the incarnation saves that which it takes up. And the incarnation comes and it takes up the human nature. And I would argue that in the human nature, it's a microcosm of the whole of the created order. And so in that, there's something more as well. So Christ comes and takes up the human nature and he reconstitutes it. Namely, he draws it back into what it was supposed to have been. We see this biblically in a couple of beautiful images, two beautiful, one tragic image, right? First image is the fall of Adam and Eve, and they're in this beautiful garden where all their needs are met, where toil is met with just as much reward, you might say, whereby when they plant a seed, it grows, etc. And what do? They decide to turn the world into their own playground rather than live it out in accordance with God's divine providence, you might say. And so we fall. We stop contemplating in our very nature the divine and turn toward ourselves and turn toward the dust from which we came. But then you have two images, and I think first of all of the image in the Gospel of Matthew of Christ going in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he cries out to God, right? He goes, "Lord, take this cup from me." And the human nature, the same human nature that was in Adam, is crying out for the same thing. And what happens? Instead, he is empowered by the divine nature to accept the cup and in love go to the crucifixion for us, right? And then the second image that we have is on the other side of that. Mary weeps as only a mother can weep for the loss of her son, right? Lord Theoden King Theoden in Lord of the Rings still has one of the best lines that I can remember. And it's that no parent should have to outlive their child. I agreed, 100%. No parent should have to outlive their child. And this is what Mary's experiencing right here. And even though there's something of the promise that Jesus resurrects, what would you think? You've never seen a resurrection before. You're still weeping. And who does she see then come up to her? Oh, the gardener. Well, what do you think the gardener is an image of? It's the new Adam who has come to bring new creation and new life. So we see that in the very beginnings of the life of Christ, we find the promise that the enemy that God is defeating in and through the incarnation, ministry, life, death, and resurrection of Christ is the enemy of death and decay. That's the enemy. And so we have a hope and a promise there. Now, what takes place in the resurrection? What takes place in the death and the resurrection? At the very least, and I think this is the very least at which we can talk about it, revelation takes place, if not more. But the revelation is the distinction between the way God intended the world to be and the way that the world is. Namely, it's the distinction between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the powers of this world. Now, the kingdom of heaven is defined explicitly in Christ's Sermon on the Mount. We have the Beatitudes, the restatement of the whole of the Mosaic law, and Christ saying that this I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Namely, Moses' law was only ever pointing toward the full truth of what I am now revealing to you, right? And the full truth of things is, it's hard. I mean, think of how awkward it is to say in the modern world, don't divorce. That's hard to say. It's hard to hear, right? Don't don't hate your enemy. Love them. Whatever, Jesus. How about my favorite of the Beatitudes? Blessed are those of you who are persecuted for my sake, for your reward will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Sweet, thanks, Jesus. That sounds awesome, right? But that's what we're supposed to think because it's a world turned upside down. And that is the nature and constitution of the kingdom of heaven that Christ is bringing about in and through the healings and the physical healing and the social healing that he draws forth and forward. And it also comes to its full head and full revelation in and through the trial and crucifixion, because now we see the true nature of what the kingdom of heaven is. It's defined by a willingness to give one's life for one's brother and sister so that they might see the truth, as opposed to what the kingdom of the powers of this world is, which is defined by pragmatic power, oratorical love of self, the law of survival. I mean, Jesus is killed very obviously in historical terms because he's a Jewish revolutionary, right? Or that's what they think of him. And Pontius Pilate wants to save his own skin, and he doesn't want to be, if you will, murdered by his Roman overlords either. And the same Caiaphas wants to prevent the hordes of Roman army from coming down upon Jerusalem. So they're living not for the true, but for the pragmatic power of the moment to retain their positions and to love themselves more than anything else. And so we have this revelatory content in the crucifixion whereby we see who we are, Caiaphas and Pilate, and Peter, right? As opposed to who Jesus is, the one who pours himself out on our behalf, the Paschal Lamb who frees us from the bondage of this world, as the Israelites were freed from Egypt, into the kingdom of heaven, the new Eden, the promised land. And there's great hope in that, because death is a part of this world, and death no longer holds sway in the resurrection, right? So anyways.
Yeah. I think in your description there, also, I hear an important link between our earlier conversation about the philosophical tradition and the Christian tradition.
Yep.
That is, people who are not Christian accuse the Christian tradition of making up the world as they'd like it to be.
Right.
But actually, what I hear you saying is, what links the Christian tradition to the philosophical tradition is the willingness to see the world as it is.
Yep.
And to know that there's a different way, right?
That's
to know if one is willing to see the world as it is, admit that can be scary,
yep.
right? But commit oneself to reflection on that and one's relationship to that. There is in fact truth at the other end of that process, and that process can be modeled for us by others, right? I think of your example of one's willingness to put oneself. Submit oneself to possible death for others. If we think of that right now, we think of those healthcare workers on the front lines in places where they're subject to this virus, right? Patient after patient after patient, and yet by their example, they give us something perhaps to look at in terms of our own reflection on the times we live in.
Yeah, right. No, I absolutely. Yeah, well said, man. I think that's really well said.
I wanted you to. I invited you to talk about the philosophical tradition, but I think it's important for our viewers to know that tradition has a connection to our own Christian tradition.
Yeah,
and
right.
They share a common purpose, right? To see the world, to examine the world, and in that process of reflecting through, if it's purely philosophical tradition, through the examples of Socrates, but our own tradition, the example of Christ,
right?
That is an opportunity again for reflecting on our own purpose and role and our own character and our own relationships with others.
And ultimately also taking hope in this situation. Hope is a real virtue. It's a real virtue. It's an infused virtue in a Catholic sense, but it's a real virtue in the sense that with hope we can still look at the world and say, this isn't the end. I mean, I guess that's why I can say some of these things with. By the way, that might be utter sentimentality. It might be I have to face that possibility in myself. Maybe I'm just utterly sentimentalizing everything that I think about the world, and I'm the person who thinks that the crush is just playing hard to get. You're right. I actually have to face that possibility. And we always do from a philosophical perspective. On the other hand, I do see the world for what it is in terms of how it functions. Death, decay, pestilence, pandemic, these are normal parts of the world as it functions. But I do also think there's a real hope, and the hope is not bound up with us and what we can do, although certainly we'll come up with a technological solution, just as we always do. Uh, but it's bound up ultimately with the fact that all of the finitude is not our end point. It's not what we're created for. It's not what any of this is created for. And we don't have to falsely admit that God is willing this into existence, right? This is part of a world that wasn't supposed to have been, but here we are.